think it's important to spend time on chapters 7, 8, and 9, even though it all seems sort of very preliminary, and let's get really at the heart of things, which start with the working day, because I think that you cannot understand the categorical apparatus unless you really go through this very carefully, in which case, if you miss that, then you're missing the rest, which seems to be much more readily available. Very frequently, when Marx writes about the labor process in this section is taken to be his statement about the labor process, period. If you read it, I think, a little more carefully, what he does is he presents it in almost exactly the same terms formally with which he presented use value at the very beginning, as something which is indeterminate, arguably transhistorical, and is the point of departure for an analysis that as the analysis proceeds, every one of the attributes of the labor process is turned on its head. And if you don't see that, and if it's always just the bee and the architect, then in a sense you are not getting what he is trying to do with the peculiar form of presentation that characterizes Volume 1 of Capital. So that when he speaks of the labor process, he characterizes it as a goal-directed activity mediating humans and nature, and an activity which is constituting of the self engaged in that activity. The elements of the labor process stripped bare are purpose of activity, the object on which work is performed, and the instruments of that work. Now, in these simple and abstract terms, the labor process is a transhistorical condition of human existence. I would also suggest that transhistorical here be understood in a very specific way. The same way that labor, concrete labor, can be understood as transhistorical. In a sense, concrete labor is transhistorical retrospectively. It is not necessarily a category that as a category is meaningful within all societies. Yet from our perspective, we can see a whole variety of activities which are seen as perhaps ontologically separate, distinct from one another. Within those societies, from our perspective, we can understand that as laboring activity. Another way of putting this is that the historical constitution of abstract labor, which is a category specific to capitalism, according to Marx, is generative of concrete labor. The difference between abstract labor and concrete labor, however, is that retrospectively you don't see abstract labor, or if you do, it's a projection. Retrospectively, you can regard a variety of different activities as being concrete labor from our perspective. Similarly, with use value, all use value, that is, to speak of everything as having a use, in a sense, is not adequate to most societies in which objects exist, because they aren't objects. You don't have a universal class of objects. From our perspective, you can look at other societies and you can regard all of these objects as objects. You just have to be very careful that what you're not doing is attributing an attitude that everything is an object to the people in that society, because that frequently will be false. Right? So that use value as the content of wealth, regardless of its social form, is correct on the one hand, but it's a statement that could only be made from the perspective of the present. Since use value is a general kind of category which subsumes all objects. Similarly, what I would suggest is what Marx writes about the labor process here should be understood in a manner analogous to the way in which he spoke about use value at the beginning. In other words, from our perspective, some form of labor process is a necessary condition of human life. And it has these fundamental elements. Now, the irony is that it's precisely within the framework of the society in which one can speak of the labor process just as one can speak of labor or objects, that the attributes of the labor process with which Marx begins are all going to be turned on their ear, on their head. And we're going to, the next 300 pages are about that. Okay? Now, toward the end of the section on the labor process, Marx talks about the subordination of the labor process to the capitalist. And he's very explicit, saying that this does not change the labor process at first. So A, this implies that it is going to change the labor process as we continue. B, to say that it doesn't change the labor process at first suggests that at that logical stage, the labor process and capital are external to one another. It's the same labor process or processes that existed. It's just that now you've got a capitalist who owns it. So if you want to, and at this point in the text, begin thinking just heuristically about what negation could mean, at this point, the negation of capital would mean getting rid of private ownership. Period. That's a much less convincing proposition once the labor process itself becomes molded by capital. As we will see, capital does not remain extrinsic to the labor process. Okay. just as the first chapter of Capital begins with the dualism of use value and value, here we've got the dualism of the labor process and the valorization process. And they follow, actually. The labor process is the use value dimension. The valorization process, obviously, is the value dimension. Now, what we began talking about, or perhaps even finished talking about last time, is that it's extremely significant here, and it drives some commentators absolutely bananas, that Marx doesn't jump in here and start talking about surplus value. That he talks about the process of the production of value. And then when he gets to surplus value, at this stage it's just, well, that's just more of the same. Why do I emphasize that? I emphasize it because in the vast majority of writing about Marx historically, the category of surplus value has been taken as a proof on Marx's part that wealth is produced by workers and is expropriated by capitalists. So that the emphasis is on the surplus. What distinguishes surplus value from other forms of the surplus is simply that it's not as evident. So you can have things like seniors last hour and a bunch of stuff that we'll hopefully get to today. Whereas what Marx is emphasizing here is that we are dealing with the form of wealth value is what's really important. And what's really important is that the surplus is a surplus of value, because that's going to give the surplus certain characteristics that can't be read off of simply the fact of surplus in and of itself. There's something very significant about the surplus in capitalism being a surplus of value. Now, as you may or may not recall, once Marx begins talking about the process of the creation of value, the various components of the labor process begin to change their significance. Let's take raw material, because that's the clearest. What happens to raw material in the process of production viewed as a labor process? It's consumed. It's used up. Right? What happens to the value? It's transmitted. Right? And in a way, this is continuing a theme that he began to develop when he was talking about money and circulation, that the object of consumption is consumed after the transaction. The money, which at the beginning of our analysis is a means, doesn't disappear. And we talked about the various fetish forms that arise because the money doesn't disappear. So here, I mean, this is very peculiar, and he's using very peculiar language in describing this. The value, you can't get rid of it, in a sense, right? It just flows through this process. It's value flowing. Right? It's not, if you just look at it as a labor process, at least with part of the means of production, the raw materials, it's just completely consumed. Here it's not. Right? We'll see a little later why he thinks this is significant. What sort of the analytic purchase of this Right? But what you have is the retention of value in time. That is, value created in the past is preserved. In a way, and this is only like an initial determination, it's a constant present. Okay. Now, whereas when we're looking at the labor process, that is, it's always just a dimension, right? These aren't two different things. When we're looking at the labor process dimension of the process of production in capitalism, according to Marx, you are looking at the quality, the character, and the content of the labor involved. Viewed in terms of a process of the creation of value, what? Yes. First of all, labor is important only quantitatively. It's the amount of labor. And in a sense, completely, if I can pick up now on what was just said, completely opposite to the way in which the labor process is described, here, labor is a raw material. And the raw materials are sponges to absorb labor time, basically. So you have this remarkably weird form, at least according to this analysis, where the actual product is objectified time. That appears, however, in the form of lots of stuff. Okay. So the purpose becomes the objectified expenditure of labor time. So that labor may appear to be purposive activity, but under these circumstances, its significance in the valorization process is as a source of value. Period. Whether you are creating steel or harvesting wheat or producing computer chips, basically, in terms of the logic of the system, what you are doing is creating value. Period. End of story. Everything else is contingent. Now, please understand, first of all, that Marx is not talking on the level of individual firms at all. Value is a category of the social totality. And that in a sense, the logical presupposition of this is an aside on my part, is the world market and capitalism as a totality. It's not the UK that then spreads, or somehow little modules get spun off and are picked up in place after place after place. And the most adequate expression of this idea that regardless of whether you're doing computer chips or wheat or steel, what you're doing is producing value, for that really to be adequate to its concept, what do you need? Which we're very, very familiar. highly developed finance capital. Just not to get, ahead of ourselves. Right? Highly developed finance capital where you have trillions of, let's call it dollars, moving constantly, seeking, small advantages. What is being produced is totally irrelevant. And once you have that sort of global system where finance can just flow in and out of all branches, you've come close to sort of the category of capital. Not a bunch of English bourgeois with their striped pants and their gray fedoras pretending they're aristocrats. It just doesn't do it in terms of the analysis itself. Okay? So, another way of putting this is that the product of the labor process viewed now as a valorization process is that the product isn't a goal but a means to absorb labor. So the expenditure of labor power isn't a means to an end, but is itself the end. So already in this chapter itself, without him then really elaborating on it, he's taken all the determinations of the labor process and turned them upside down. So the last thing in the world you should do in reading Marx is to take a little thing on the bee and the architect or whatever, which you'll find in countless accounts, and that this is the essence of labor. It sort of misses the point of the analysis. That a full day's work produces more value than that which is required to reproduce the worker. If that isn't the case, you don't have capital. That is to say, regardless of how you determine what, as we will see later, he calls necessary labor time, whether you're going to view it in terms of just basic physical needs in order to live, or if you're going to include a whole panoply of other dimensions that people regard as being part and parcel of life, regardless of which one it is, there's got to be this gap. This is not, however, according to Marx, an injustice towards the worker. Right? What he's trying to get away from is the idea that capitalism is sort of based on cheating. For him, it's not. Of course, there are, hundreds of thousands of cheaters, millions. But that isn't the point, as far as he's concerned. The point is, and we're going to come now to the implications of this when we talk about the working day, the point is that at least at first determination, you have the meeting of two commodity owners, the capitalist and the worker. Let's do it just individual at the beginning. It'll change. The worker has a commodity that they sell. And the commodity that they sell is labor power. However, the use that the capitalist makes of that labor power has a value which goes far beyond the value of the labor power itself. Or to put it another way, more value is produced than is required to sustain the working class. we will return to this issue with the working day. Did we do constant and variable capital? Okay. Just before we move on to that, I just want to hammer home once again the point that this kind of weird reversal that we were talking about, where the raw material becomes like a sponge to absorb labor time, you notice this does not depend on private ownership. It's a function of the form of wealth. I'd like to try and make clear a couple things that are going on in this chapter. First of all, let's go back before we go to the rate of surplus value. Constant and variable capital. Now, obviously, this is from what perspective?
Valorization process.
From the valorization process, right? Now, with reference to the valorization process, or no, from the perspective of the valorization process, two components of the labor process that viewed as labor process are distinct from one another are melded into one another. Right? Raw materials and machines are all constant capital. We will see that he is going to make a distinction. But right now, which means that if he's right now, what is the difference between constant and variable capital? And this will then eventually, but not right now, get us to the rate of surplus value. What does constant capital do? What does variable capital do? Yes?
Constant capital has its value transferred to the object, and variable capital produces new value.
Okay. Variable capital refers to that dimension of the process that is generative of new value. Constant capital is simply the transmission of value. So, as far as Marx is concerned, in value terms, machinery, raw material do not generate new value. They transmit value that they already contain, their value. New value is created by the workers. The workers, however, are creating new value at every second that they're working. Which is why later he's going to attack this notion, you work 3 hours for this, 3 hours for that, 3 hours, that's a fetish farm. Right? It's simply new value that's created. That new value then becomes divided into necessary and surplus. But there's nothing qualitatively distinct between necessary and surplus. And that is divided according to the class struggle, and that's what we will come to. Yes?
Just a question about that. What is wrong with looking at it the other way? Where do your calculations go wrong if you divide it up in the first place, like Senior does in his example?
Because he's going to argue that isn't the way capitalism works. And it's the emergence of relative surplus value, which someone already put on the table, which is ever increasing levels of productivity, which completely undermine that argument. And the move towards relative surplus value happens historically once the working day is limited. That's the distinction he makes between absolute and relative surplus value. We'll get into that. Okay? Again, each chapter, in a sense, illuminates the stuff that came before it. So that the full answer to what you're saying only emerges later when we read relative surplus value. Okay? Now, for Marx, it's very important that constant capital, variable capital, that if you really want to understand the valorization process, you have to understand this distinction. However, if you look at it in purely physical terms, there's no way you can come up with this distinction. So once again, and this is a theme that sort of exists throughout Volume 1, the material dimension veils the social dimension. So it's not just that labor process is going to be transformed by valorization process, but that most people understand the process of production simply as a labor process. It might be a labor process that's owned by the capitalists, but it's just a labor process. And if you do that, according to Marx, you don't understand surplus value. We don't either. But in a sense, we're on the trail of surplus value. So that the distinction between raw material and machinery, which is crucial if you're looking at a labor process, viewed from the standpoint of valorization is not crucial, with some modifications that I'm just going to have to introduce now. Right, so it's not just, it works both ways. It's not just that the valorization process is going to take the labor process and mold it in its image, but that the physical materialist dimension almost always veils the social dimension. Which is why the last thing in the world Marx is a physicalist materialist. Okay? Now, there's another fetish that he begins to look at when he talks about what happens if productivity, it had to do with, was it weaving or spinning? At any rate, will you use 6 times as much wool? What happens in value terms? No. A bunch of things happen.
If you just add wool, then you are adding value, but the value is just transmitted. The constant capital doesn't bring new value into existence beyond the labor that.
So the increase in productivity, on the one hand, doesn't increase the amount of new value produced, right? As a matter of fact, that new value produced is distributed over a greater amount of, the product. On the one hand. On the other hand, you have much more value being transmitted. So the end result will disguise the fact that no more new value is produced. Whereas with machinery, viewed in terms of value, there's an interesting difference. The machine does not transmit its entire value, right?
Not all at once.
Yes, that's what I meant.
Yeah.
You're perfectly correct. It doesn't transmit it all at once. You have depreciation, right, over time. So on any given day, it transmits, let's say, 1,000th of its value. So that an enormous increase in productivity is not doesn't correlate with much more value being transmitted by the machine. This is going to become important later in his analysis. So that whereas if you're looking at the raw material, the amount of the use value passing through the process and the amount of value that's being transmitted are sort of correlate to one another. With the machinery, they don't at all. So the machinery can generate gigantic increases in use value, but the amount of value it's going to transmit is going to be no greater than when the level of productivity was lower. Unless there's speed up and so the machine is depreciating a little faster. Note that difference, because it will be important later. But basically, variable capital is the creation of new value. So you have a system where the only source, and this is consistent with the definitions that he made at the beginning, so each time he's trying then to justify them, you have a system where the only source of new value is labor. So that of the three components, C is simply a transmission. V plus S is what is created new every minute. It's a V plus S. The ratio of V plus S is different. That is, it's a different question. You'll notice here that surplus value is not the same thing as profit. We're not going to really get to profit until volume 3. But at this point, it's worth asking, or at least bearing in mind, so what in the world is surplus value about? It's not simply to indicate that the capitalists are ripping off even more than might appear to be the case. So that S over V is a different quantitative magnitude than S over C plus V. Now, rather, S over C plus V disguises what's really important, which is S over V, and we're going to have to try to figure out why is that really important. This does have implications, incidentally, far-reaching implications for attempts to analyze, let's say, the contemporary world. And it's actually a very difficult methodological problem. Because what Marx shows, no better, what he argues, is that you can go from value to profit and price, but not vice versa. He does that several times already. So in other words, you have many Marxist theorists who will talk about crises, and they will look at rates of profit, and from that they're going to try to conclude stuff about rates of surplus value. Well, that's a very tricky proposition. You can't do so easily. But we don't have to worry about that right now. But basically, this entire really complicated mode of presentation is an attempt to we see that surplus value is not the same as profit. Then we really are confronted with the question, so what is value theory all about? For a political economist, it's not an issue. Because I'm talking about classical political economy, because they don't make the systematic distinction between profit and prices, between profit and surplus value. Marx is making a systematic distinction between them. And as you will see, when we reach the famous tendency of the rate of profit to fall in the third volume of Capital, Marx doesn't make, it's not his. He doesn't think it's an axiom of classical political economy. B, he has all sorts of countervailing tendencies. In other words, what he's going to be doing is treating it as a surface phenomenon that's misleading, rather than at the heart of so-called Marxist economics, which you'll hear over and over and over again ad nauseum. It's at the heart of Smithian and Ricardian economics, and Malthusian, not Marx. But still, even if I say that that's the case, and even if I can show you, Marx says, hey, it's not me, that in itself doesn't answer the question that I'm posing. So what is value theory about, if it's not about this? Because what it means is that this book, in terms of its self-understanding, is not a book of economics. It's not a book of political economy. That isn't what it's about. Surplus value and the development of constant capital. What it says is that S over V says that the surplus is a function of direct labor time expenditure regardless of C. Meaning, regardless of the development of constant capital. This is very counterintuitive. The rate of surplus value is independent of the value of constant capital. Now, since constant capital includes instruments of production, machinery, the rate of surplus value is independent of the value of machinery. It's important. But notice it. Okay, now, also, that little chart, I've just charted for you the last major section of the book, so that we started with the formula for capital MCM prime as dynamic, right? You take the C in the middle, and that becomes the labor process and the valorization process. Each time the left-hand side disguises the right-hand side. The labor process disguises, veils the valorization process. The valorization process divides into two in the exposition, constant capital and variable capital. Constant capital disguises variable capital. Variable capital divides into two, necessary labor time. Surplus labor time, necessary labor time disguises surplus value time. You think you get, you're paid for a full day's work. And once you've got the necessary and surplus, you're back to self-valorizing value. So it's kind of like it hooks back. This is the structure of the last 100 pages. This is the first place in the book Capital where we run into the category of class. And the way in which class is treated here is very significant, and it sort of, I would suggest, flies in the face of many common understandings of class. First, before we get to class, let's get to temporality, and the two in this chapter are closely related. So this is a struggle about what? Okay, the length of the working day. Now you'll notice it's a different struggle than the kind that, let's say, E.P. Thompson mentioned, that was also mentioned in the report. What does the working day already imply in terms of the structure of time and the structure of work?
Social totality.
Okay, but yes.
That it's uniform.
That it's uniform, right? There's no such thing as uniform labor time way earlier. People live much more like students. Suddenly you realize, oh my God, I have to really work hard, and you work very, very hard, and while you're working really hard, you think, this isn't so bad. I could do it all the time, and of course you don't. And they're just these rhythms. And the initial struggles of the incipient working class is really against this kind of homogenization of time, period. And the homogenization of time actually arguably begins in Flanders after the Black Death, where you have bells in the towns, and the bells are not church bells. Has nothing to do with the church at all. Time in Flanders is taken away from the church, and it's put on the Rathhäuser, on the city halls. It's the time of the bourgeoisie. And the bells are there for everybody. It's not to make nice music like, Rockefeller, but it tells you in an hour the factory is going to, and they have factories. In an hour the factory is going to, the gates will be open, and in an hour and 5 minutes they'll be closed. The entire city moves according to these bells. And you have, for the first time, a working day that is not a function of sunrise and sunset. The idea of a uniform, and of course this really takes centuries to effect, and this article that was mentioned in the report by E.P. Thompson is a classic on this, and everyone should read it. It's a little poignant. This is a side point. E.P. Thompson wrote this in the 1960s, where he thought the real problem is, what are we going to do with all this leisure time that is just around the corner? Because everybody in the 1960s was talking about the challenge of leisure time. Then the 70s happened. Although in Europe, they actually continue to focus more on time than in the United States, much more. With the result that whereas an average American worker gets 2 weeks vacation a year, an average Western European worker gets 5 to 6. It makes a difference in terms of quality of life, I think. Which means they're actually much more productive in the period when they're working. Be that as it may, we're talking about a completely new organization of work that is tied to a completely new organization of temporality. It's homogeneous. You don't work more in this season, less in that season. Ideally, you work your 16-hour day 6 or 7 days a week, period. That's what they're going to try to effect, regardless of whether it's winter or summer, whatever. And at work, you work. At least they want to make sure that you work, which is why you get today, they would call it middle management, but in those days they were just called like overseers. Going through these places of production, making sure that people are working. So in a sense, the struggle for the 10-hour working day is a struggle that already presupposes the success of this homogenization of time. It's no longer, in temporal terms, a Luddite revolt. Where you take Saint Monday. That was a big thing. Monday is a saint's day, by definition. It basically meant that's when you were recovering from all the alcohol that you had the previous 24 hours.
Or consumed another 24 hours.
Or consumed?
Another 24 hours worth of alcohol.
Right. And that's when you began to get this class difference with drinking, too. That really opens up in the 17th century because Europeans are basically drunk in the 15th and 16th centuries. They just drink enormous amounts, and each inn has 2 rooms, a room to get drunk in and a room to pass out in. And in cities like London, suddenly in the 17th century, you get a new drug. Coffee. Until the British decide that it's a good idea to take tea and transplant it from China into India, and everybody in the UK then starts to drink tea, they drink a lot of coffee. There are 3,000 coffee houses in London in the 17th century. And a lot of business is done in the coffee houses. Lloyd's is a coffee house little insurance thing. At any rate, at that point, gin becomes something, a sign of the lower classes, and the upper classes, in theory, or the productive, no. The bourgeoisie drink coffee. The gentry are still drunk. Now, what Marx is trying to do here is, given this homogenization, he's introducing the commodity form on multiple levels. One level, we've already just been talking about. As soon as you begin talking about homogenization and uniformity, you are within his categorical apparatus talking about the commodity form. There's no need to posit some mysterious process of rationalization that blows down the corridors of history. It's grounded here, and Lukács was the first to try that. I disagree with this thing of space and time, but that's because Lukács doesn't have a sense of historical time. But we'll leave that aside. So he's only got one side of the dynamic. But the other side of the commodity form that is very strong in this chapter is a struggle of commodity owners. It's not simply a struggle of oppressor and oppressed, of exploiter and exploited. Surely there are exploited people in many, many, many different social formations. But here, what characterizes these two groups is that both, in terms of their consciousness, are commodity owners. So that the self-consciousness of the workers is fundamentally different, according to Marx, than, let's say, late medieval peasants. There were many uprisings, although there's some who would argue that the 16th century German peasant uprisings already were sort of pre-bourgeois forms, but we're not going to go there. They are commodity owners, and as was also mentioned in the report, basically the relationship is totalizing. And it's totalizing not because of the group of people themselves, but because class is defined here with reference to a global structure. So if I can just elaborate a little further on something that was mentioned in the report, a struggle between peasants and lords, which happened all the time. In one corner of wherever, Galicia in Poland, had absolutely no implications for what was going on in Galicia in Spain. None. Zip. It's local. With capital, class struggle is global. The concept. That doesn't mean that the empirie is always there. So that you have, for example, one body of thought, and it's only one, but one body of thought in talking about the grounds for the crisis of the early 1970s, the global crisis of the early 1970s. There's one body of thought that claims that it's precisely because workers in the West achieved unprecedented gains between 1968 and 1972 that capital shut down and started to go elsewhere. So that the gains by Italian or French or German or American workers were obviated by capital going global. There are other people who disagree, but whether or not one thinks that this is an adequate theory for 1973, and no serious person thinks it's just oil. Regardless, the point is, however, and this is the other side of the coin of what I was saying earlier about financialization and the flows of capital, that changes in the relation between bourgeoisie and workers here is directly tied to the relation there. So that in the emphatic sense, class is a historically specific category. It's totalizing, and it is intimately bound up with a self-understanding as commodity owner, with rights. So in this struggle between the capitalists, who at this point, of course, want workers to work as long as humanly possible, or maybe even inhumanly possible, and workers who want as much time for themselves as possible, who's right? Both, according to Marx. Both. So the concept of right is also contextual. And in the struggle of right versus right, force decides. But what that means is that class struggle is introduced here as an ongoing feature of capitalism, and as ongoing not because the capitalists are always squeezing the workers, they are, but that doesn't make them unique, but because of the A, fluid nature of the relationship, and B, the self-understanding and structural existence of both sides as commodity owners. So it doesn't, the word class struggle should not be always thought of as being surrounded by a red halo. And it's kind of like revolution. It's an ongoing feature of capitalist life. So that the chapter begins with the workers formally as commodity owners. It ends with them actually as commodity owners. Because you're really only a commodity owner if you can bargain over the conditions of the sale of your commodity. Which means that within the framework of Marx's analysis, there's a kind of an interesting paradox that flies completely in the face of an all too common identification of capitalism with the individual period and collectivism with socialism. The only way the proletariat can act as commodity owners is through collective action. So it's not that the collective action in any way undermines or flies in the face of their Dasein as commodity owners, but it's the condition for them being commodity owners. Which might help explain what was a very common topos in socialist thought, which was that the task of the working class is to realize the ideals of the French Revolution. That the French Revolution, the ideals, have transhistorical universal significance. They've been betrayed by the grubby particularistic interests of the slimy bourgeoisie. And the proletariat will realize these general values in the name of general humanity. Within the framework of capital, the ideals of the French Revolution are the ideals bound to the commodity and capital. Not in any, this isn't a put down. It doesn't mean that therefore you can just sort of flush them down the toilet. But rather they don't exceed the bounds of capitalism. They are a dimension of capitalism. And within this framework, it becomes possible to understand the ideal of the French Revolution among many socialist movements as being part and parcel of their Dasein as collective commodity owners. And from their perspective, then the difference is collective and individual.